Hello and welcome back to the Starlings One podcast. We've got a very interesting episode today, one that's close to my heart. My wife works in food shelf type distributions. I don't want to really say it's a food shelf, but it's that kind of field. So this has been very interesting to me. Basically what we have is a study from the Chicago Booth School that was in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which is a very high impact factor study. And it's about a large organization called Feeding America, which in the year 2005 had shifted from a centralized food distribution planning system to using effectively a prediction market, which they call Meal Connect. And the study, I will make sure there's a link in the description. The study was pretty excited about Meal Connect, just from the standpoint of economists don't normally get to study things that involve a fake currency in real life. It was also very positive on the decentralized planning aspect of Meal Connect versus what was previously a centralized planning way of distributing food. A lot of really interesting case study points here came out of this, but also the podcast that you're going to hear. Again, it's an AI generated podcast using a podcast generating engine. Very interesting this time around because there's a new feature. It's in what they call interactive mode that allowed me to interject while the AI podcast hosts were speaking. And the result of myself interjecting and them talking was later processed and turned into a final result podcast, which I thought did a much better job than just having the AI podcasters talk and summarize on their own. I think it made for a much better podcast, so I think you're really going to enjoy this. Yeah, it doesn't have my voice as being an interjector. I want to be clear. It's really just their conversation. But again, this is the result of my interjecting while they were talking. So it's sort of like pre-prompting the large language model along the way. Again, very interesting stuff. Hope you enjoy it. Oh, hey, and I almost forgot. Jump on over to starlings.one for more information. Check out all of our different socials. And you can also check out our completely open source and MIT licensed prediction market called Social Predict. If you just search Social Predict on GitHub or just Google or whatever way you want to find it online. You know how to find things. Just search Social Predict, prediction market. All right, great. Thanks. Enjoy the episode.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Ready to jump into another fascinating topic with me today?
Always. I love our deep dives.
Me too. And today we're looking at something maybe a little different. How food gets to those in need right here in the U.S.
Food banks, food pantries.
Exactly. You know, those organizations working tirelessly to make sure everyone has enough to eat.
Really important work, especially with, food insecurity on the rise these days.
Absolutely. And that's where Feeding America comes in, the nation's largest hunger relief organization. We're talking a massive network of food banks across the country.
Oh, yeah, Feeding America. They're doing some pretty amazing things. I've seen some of their logistics. It's pretty impressive.
Right. Distributing literally millions of pounds of donated food every year. So we've got some great research to guide us today, both from Feeding America itself and from some academic journals that have looked at this system.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I think it sets up a really fun challenge for us listeners, too. Think about this. 300 million pounds of food donated. How do you get all that food to where it needs to go?
Yep.
To all those different food banks across the country.
Yeah, that's a lot of food to think about. Where do you even begin? I mean, I guess you'd want to be fair about it. Make sure everyone gets their share.
Exactly. My first instinct, too, split it all up equally. Every food bank gets the same amount. Seems pretty fair, right?
Yeah, makes sense on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
But you start to think about it.
Right. Like, are all food banks actually the same?
Yeah. Do they all need the same kinds of food? Which, if you think about it for a minute, probably not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where this research gets super interesting because, well, first we have to acknowledge something that I found really surprising.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
So all those donations that Feeding America is distributing, That's actually only about 25% of what a regional food bank typically gets.
Wait, really? Only
Okay.
25%.
Yeah. The other 75%, who knows? It could be from local grocery stores, farms, individual donations.
Wow. Okay. So we're already talking about a more complex picture than you might think.
Exactly. So some food banks might be overflowing with, say, canned goods.
And others are desperate for fresh produce.
Right. Or like, I don't know, imagine a food bank in Idaho being offered a truckload of potatoes.
When their warehouse is already packed with potatoes.
Exactly. So if you just had a simple queue system,
First come, first served.
you could actually end up with a lot of wasted food,
Hmm.
right? And a lot of unmet needs.
Inefficient at best.
Yeah. So how did Feeding America tackle this? How do you make sure the right food is getting to the right place at the right time?
Well, back in 2005, they decided to do something pretty radical.
Ooh, radical. I like
They
it.
got rid of that old queue system
Okay.
and implemented something called the choice system. And the really interesting thing is, it's actually a market-based approach.
A market-based, wait, like food banks are buying and selling food.
Not exactly buying and selling, but they are using a special kind of currency, they call them shares, to bid on the truckloads of food they need.
Okay, so my skeptical side is already coming out here. A market-based system for food banks.
Hmm.
Doesn't that just give the advantage to the bigger, wealthier organizations? You know, the ones with all the fancy fundraising dinners.
That's a totally valid concern. And honestly, a lot of people were worried about that when the system was first rolled out. But the really brilliant part of the choice system is how it addresses that exact issue.
Okay, I'm listening.
So those shares I mentioned, they're not connected to how much money a food bank can raise.
Ah, okay.
They're distributed based on need.
Interesting.
So the more people a food bank serves, the more buying power they have in the system.
So it actually kind of levels a playing field.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's a system designed with fairness in mind.
I am officially intrigued. Tell me more about this bidding process. Are we talking like, some Hunger Games style arena where food banks are battling it out for a truckload of canned peaches?
Nothing quite so dramatic. But it is pretty cool. Picture this. Twice a day, food banks log into this online auction platform,
Okay.
and they can see everything that's available. We're talking fresh produce, canned goods, even things like diapers.
Diapers at a food bank.
Yeah, I know, right? It's not always just about food. Sometimes it's about those essential non-food items that families struggle to afford.
Right, makes sense.
So anyway, they see all these items up for bid, and then they use their shares to bid on the truckloads they want. Highest bidder wins.
So it's like eBay for food banks.
Yeah, basically. Pretty wild, right?
It is. I can see how that gives each food bank the power to really get what they need.
Wow.
What if a smaller food bank can't afford to bid on a whole truckload of, say, cereal?
Oh, they thought of that. There's a feature called fractional bidding.
Rational bidding.
Yeah. Food banks can team up and bid on part of a truckload.
Oh, cover.
So even the smallest food bank can get what they need without breaking the bank.
I love it. Makes you wonder, what about the less desirable stuff? The food that nobody seems to want, like Brussels sprouts.
Uh-huh. Actually, the system accounts for that too. You can bid negative prices.
Negative.
Yep. So essentially, you're getting paid in shares to take those unwanted items off someone else's hands.
So you could actually end up with more shares by taking something nobody else wants.
Exactly. Prevents waste and helps balance things out.
Wow, they really thought this through, didn't they?
Okay.
But how well is it actually working in practice? Is it really this fair and efficient utopia that it sounds like?
You might be surprised. It's actually been remarkably successful.
Really?
Yeah, so much so that, well, you know how they had to set up a committee to oversee fairness and equity in the system?
Right. Makes sense. Got to have some oversight.
Well, get this. They've never actually had to meet.
They've never had to meet. So there hasn't been a single issue with fairness that's required their intervention.
Nope. Apparently, it's just working that well.
Wow. Color me impressed. So you're telling me a market-based system for food banks is not only possible, it's actually thriving.
It's pretty amazing, right? But of course, like any system, it's got its quirks, its intricacies.
Of course. We're just scratching the surface here. So let's dive into some of those details and try to figure out what makes this system tick.
Okay, I'm definitely hooked now. A market-based system for food banks that's actually fair.
It really is. And the more you dig into it, the more fascinating it gets. Like, have you ever thought about what a food bank might be willing to pay the most for?
Honestly, probably something healthy, fresh produce, all that good stuff.
You'd think so, right? But In the system, in the choice system, the prices for different food items can be all over the place.
Really?
Yeah, like you can get 49 pounds of produce for the same price as just 1 pound of cereal.
Wait, what? That doesn't sound right. Why would produce be so cheap?
It's all about something called residual demand. Remember, food banks aren't just getting food from Feeding America. Right, right. We talked about that, the other 75%.
Yeah, exactly. So the prices in the choice system, they basically reflect what food banks still need after they've got everything they can from those other sources.
Just sort of kind of filling in the gaps.
Exactly. The price of produce is low, not because food banks don't want it, but because they probably already have a lot of it.
Makes sense.
Cereal, on the other hand, that's harder to come by, so they're willing to pay a premium for it.
Ah, I see. It's like an auction where the most desperate bidders are the ones who haven't been able to get what they need elsewhere.
Pretty much. And that's what's so cool about this system, right? It's not just distributing food, it's actually giving us this really unique window into, well, into the needs and challenges of different food banks across the country.
It's like a snapshot of food insecurity across the nation.
Wow.
Wow.
And it gets even more interesting because, well, the system isn't just reflecting existing needs, it's actually changing the way food banks operate.
Okay, how so?
So the research shows that food banks have actually been able to use this system, this choice system, to, well, to shift their focus and get more of the foods that they really need.
Oh, interesting. So we can see that in the data.
Oh, yeah, big time. It's actually pretty fascinating. So essentially, what we see is that food banks are kind of sorting themselves into two categories:
Okay.
food rich and food poor.
Makes sense. So like the food-rich banks are the ones who are already pretty well stocked from those other sources. And the food-poor banks are the ones who are, well, they're relying more heavily on Feeding America to fill their shelf.
You got it. And their behavior in the choice system,
Yeah.
it's really different. Like the food-rich banks,
Yeah.
they're using the system to, well, to actually cut down on those low-quality staples, like produce,
Yeah.
stuff that they probably already have a lot of.
Yeah.
And they're using those savings, essentially, to stock up on higher quality items.
Like cereal.
Exactly. Cereal, protein, that kind of stuff. Now, the food poor banks, they're doing the opposite. They're focusing on getting as much of those basics as possible.
So they're trading away some of their high-quality surplus to get more of those low-quality essentials.
Oh, got it. It's all about maximizing value, right?
Okay, but how big of a difference are we talking about here?
So over a 5-year average, the food-rich banks, they ended up with about 700,000 pounds less low-quality food than they would have gotten under the old system.
Oh, okay, that's a lot of food.
It is. And they used that surplus to increase their high-quality food by about 100,000 pounds. Now, the food-poor banks, they were able to snag an extra 400,000 pounds of those low-quality essentials.
Okay, those are some pretty significant shifts. It's amazing to think that this system, it's not just about getting food to those in need, it's also about helping food banks.
Well, optimize their inventories, right?
Yeah, and make sure that they're providing a wider variety of options to their clients.
Exactly. It's really win-win. And the cool thing is, it's not just about the long-term averages either. If you zoom in and look at, shorter time frames, like a couple of months, you see even more dramatic shifts happening.
Oh, wow. So it's super responsive.
Yeah. Food banks can adjust their strategies based on what's available and what they need at any given moment.
It's like a constantly evolving ecosystem. Right. With food banks reacting to these market signals to make sure they're getting the best possible value for their shares.
Exactly. It's pretty brilliant.
It is.
Yeah.
I'm kind of blown away by this whole thing. Okay, so we've talked a lot about demand, but what about supply? Has this choice system had any impact on how much food is actually entering the system?
That's a great question. And the answer is a resounding yes. Remember how we talked about those negative prices?
Yeah, where you could basically get paid to take unwanted items.
Exactly. Well, there's a similar feature called maroon pounds. And this is where, well, food banks can essentially sell their surplus food to other food banks within the system.
Wait, so food banks can actually make money by getting rid of their extra stuff. That's wild.
It is. And it's adding something like 12 million pounds of food to the system every year.
12 million pounds. And
Yeah.
it's generally higher quality food too, right?
Yep. So it's a win-win for everyone involved. And, remember all those concerns we talked about earlier about smaller food banks being disadvantaged by this whole market system?
Right, right.
Well, the system actually has a bunch of safeguards in place to address that.
Like what?
Well, things like credit. So food banks can borrow shares if they need to, And then there's joint bidding. So smaller food banks can team up and bid on larger quantities of food. But the most remarkable thing, none of those safeguards seem to have been necessary.
Really? So even with this whole market-based approach, there haven't been any major issues with fairness or equity?
Nope, not a single one. The data shows that credit use is pretty common, and some food banks are using joint bidding really effectively, but that Fairness and Equity Committee, the
Yeah.
one designed to intervene and make sure things are fair,
Right.
they haven't had to lift a finger.
Wow. And this system sounds almost too good to be true.
I know, right? It's pretty incredible.
Feeding America has managed to create this system that's, well, it's not only efficient, but it's incredibly equitable. And to think it all started with this simple question, how do we get the right food to the right people at the right time? And they came up with this market-based system that, by all accounts, is actually working.
It really makes you rethink how we approach these complex social problems, doesn't it?
I know. You always hear about how markets, make inequality worse. But this is like the opposite.
Yeah. This is markets used to actually help people. It's pretty amazing.
Totally. It's definitely made me rethink things a little bit. Makes you wonder, though, if this kind of system works so well for food distribution, what else could we be doing?
Right. Like, what other challenges could we solve if we thought about them this way?
Exactly.
Hmm.
Could you apply this kind of market-based thinking to other things like, I don't know, healthcare
Ooh.
or affordable housing?
Yeah. Or even like access to educational resources.
Right. It's almost like one innovative solution can spark all these other ideas.
It's like a ripple effect. You
Right.
solve one problem and then suddenly you see possibilities everywhere.
That's what I love about these deep dives. It's not just learning cool facts.
Yeah.
It's like this, I don't know, it's like expanding your way of thinking about the world.
Totally.
Yeah.
Seeing things from a different angle.
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe you'll be the one to come up with the next big idea.
Uh-huh. Maybe. So if any of our listeners out there are, inspired to learn more about Feeding America's Choice System, we've got links to all the source material in the show notes. Definitely worth checking out.
It's a fascinating read. Really gets you thinking.
It does. Well, that's it for this deep dive. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into something awesome.
Can't wait. Until then, happy learning, everyone.
Happy learning.